guess it would be fair to say a happenstance series of discussions, interviews related to exhibitions that we mount in the library. The last go-round, some of you may recall, got a little raucous, but I think in the end was was not so bad. Raymond Abraham's piece in Beijing with a commentary by Raymond and Pafford Clay and Tom Main and I. This context is probably slightly more congeniality of the year award. But Mike has just published his first monograph by Rizzoli International. And on the occasion of that publication, we decided to make a small exhibition of a recent project and to talk a little bit about the book, the meaning of the book, Michael's relationship to Sciarc and other related or unrelated subject matter. I think you'll all get an opportunity to take a look at the book, and I assume you have to put down some minimum das Kapital for this, consistent with the history of Rizzoli. So maybe some of you have seen it, probably most of you haven't. One of the things that struck me, and I haven't read all of it, was that there is a substantial piece on Sciarc itself and the meaning of Sciarc and the origin of Sciarc. And Michael, of course, was the director a couple of sessions back. And one of the things that struck me about that, first of all, it's very unusual, I think, for a monograph which is very much about the work and the practice and the strategy and the method and the ideals of an architect or a team of architects, at least conventionally, to depart from that pro forma. And maybe we'll get into this in more general terms about whether Michael's perspective and his role in the profession has to do with a particular kind of departure. But nevertheless, the piece on Sciarc was unusual. I'd like Michael to talk about it a little bit. But my sense of it was it's idealistic as a sense of a vantage point located somewhere in the past where there was energy and optimism and belief and conviction. And it's written in the past tense, actually. The text is in the past tense. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why it was included and what Sciarc meant to you as the impetus or part of the impetus for a book, and why it's written in the past tense. And I think the reason for asking about that has to do with whether your assumption is that that kind of idealism, optimism, energy, momentum, focus has ended.
I think a quick answer to that is, I would say not necessarily ended here, but I think it has ended. I think it has ended. I think there's other things that motivate us. I heard once a conversation between two movie makers of different generations, one of my generation, one of the current generation, and they basically took different positions. One was a position of morality, and the other one was a position of irony. And as they talked about it, it seemed to me that was pretty much sort of a clear description of the way things are these days. I'm not saying necessarily here or a particular group of people, but I don't want to go too far into it, but I think that there's a lot of systems that we've produced to make our lives go in the direction we want them to go, and those systems now are the software and we're the hardware. And I think we've lost control of certain things. Not forever, because I think there's certain aspects of our existence that go dormant, but like riding a bicycle, you never really forget. But I think we're at a point in human history where that was laid out by Kubrick and Arthur Clark in 2001, except we haven't yet pulled the plug on Hal. But the piece on Sciarc, there was a story, or there was a book by Calvino, Italo Calvino, Invisible Cities, which many of you know, and Marco Polo describing to Kubla Khan all the cities in Khan's empire. And about 2/3 of the way through the book, or 2/3 of the way through Khan's cities, the great Khan realizes that Marco Polo, even though he's describing what Khan originally believed to be the cities in his empire, he's actually doing it through the lens of Venice, Italy. And so he asks the question, are you only describing Venice? And he says, yes. Everything I see is in the context of that place because that's where I'm from. I think that's my relationship. I think the way I see the world is through all of the experiences, I mean, a number of experiences, but I think essentially the formative years was here. It's here. And the optimism comes, how could you not have optimism being part of a place like this from the very beginning? Anything imaginable is possible. This place is living proof of that. So I remain optimistic. Not that my dark side comes out once in a while, but I'm very, very optimistic. I think humans are inherently good, and we self-correct back to goodness. Right now, we're like way out, trying to come back. But this place is really a touchstone for me. This project in particular was. For me, it was a dream come true to be able to download 30 years of experience into a project. That's really what. I always assumed when I was working on this, I stayed quiet, but I always thought that if Sciarc had $20 million, this is what they would do. This is what we would do. And although the buildings, as presented in photographs and in models and monographs and all the rest, are looked at as a thing. The building wasn't designed as a thing. It was designed from the inside out. It was really about the life on the inside. And in some way, trying to create a facsimile of the five-ring circus that happens in this place.
This wasn't really an attempt to create a kind of cheerleaders environment, either for the profession or for Sciarc. I think it really had to do with just reading why were we doing this, what would we achieve. It was a time of da-da-da-da-da-da. And in fact, it is, as I said, written in the past tense. And if that represented a perspective at a certain point in time, I think the next question is, what's the next perspective at this point in time? Maybe we can find another way of getting to that. The name of the book is, well, at least a piece of the name of the book is Still Points. Still Points. Make sure I get it right. Don't let me. Still Points. There's a poem that I know, and some of you may know, written by T.S. Eliot called The Four Quartets, which was, I think, probably written in the 30s or in the 40s, and it's about a kind of religious conversion from not Gnosticism, but agnosticism, and Eliot became an English Catholic or an Episcopalian. And one of the key phrases in the text is the still point of the turning world. So this is a famous literary phrase, and I think people who read that know it to mean something which is intentionally contradictory and creates a fundamental tension between something which is still and something which moves. So that might have some kind of very particular meaning. It had a religious meaning. The question is, what is the meaning of that nomenclature in the context of a discussion of architecture?
The still point is where everything comes to rest. It's the point in between all extremes. Everything in the universe is symmetrical, not visually symmetrical, but the fact that energy can't be created nor destroyed means that there's a center point around which everything moves through or moves around. Eliot used still point. Thomas Merton, who became, through his writings, a mentor, had a similar phrase. He called it, in French, it sounds different, but it's the virgin point. It's the point where the pendulum hits the tangent and then returns again. It's where one thing becomes another. It's where earth becomes sky. It's literally and figuratively the point that when you're in meditation you try to get to. You become incredibly focused and very still, and everything opens up. You see more than you couldn't have expected to see as much as that. So it's an aspiration. It's an aspiration. The piece that we did here a couple of years ago was to try to find the line where matter and light come together, let's say. How to create space with light, not making an object, which was pretty, what I spent the first a large part of my life doing, primarily focused on, which I'm still making objects, but the focus is, the attitude in my mind is different. But it was about trying to find your place, not outside of yourself, but inside of yourself. So the still point is a kind of, not a religious conversion, but a kind of spiritual conversion.
Some of these, I think the discussion is, I don't know whether a little bit elusive, not so accessible always. And if we could find a way to talk to you and you could find a way to pick it up and understand it and respond, maybe we've communicated something. I don't think the intention is to speak obscurely and to make a virtue out of a kind of obscurantism. At least that's not my objective. I think the issue for me was that what was intriguing about the juxtaposition between still and moving, in a religious sense, a conceptual sense, in architecture, in a philosophical sense, in Eliot's case, had to do with a juxtaposition of something that moves and something that stands still, and the relationship between what seems to be constantly in flux and what might solidify. In other words, is there anything solid or is it all in motion? And I think we're in a culture which suggests, if you're not careful, that everything is noisy as hell and certainly in motion. And I think the point was that in the naming of the book, the tension between the possibilities of still and moving was not part of the labeling of the titling of the book. This is really what I'm asking about, and maybe this is the intention.
I think that, well, the still point isn't a point. The still point can be a line that moves through. It's a center of gravity that runs through the body. It's a center of gravity that can run through space. One of the stories that I wrote in there, the stories are intended to sort of describe experiences without explaining them. Describe experiences where, you learn something that can be used in an architectural situation. In the case of the moving point, or the center of gravity, was whitewater rafting and discovering the line in the river. If you find the line in the river, and you don't find it with your eyeballs, you find it with your body. The great navigators that went from throughout Polynesia would navigate by laying in the bottom of the canoe, and they would read the currents with their body. In the case of the rafting, you stay dry if you find the line, and you don't find the line by looking at it. Just intuitively, you can feel the line. And when we did this for a week, my son and I, by the end of it, I was able to visualize line that runs through the river where the water is moving the fastest because there's the least amount of resistance because there's no rocks. And that's how you stay in the boat. And it's a smooth ride. You're basically in fifth gear. So you're moving fast and slow at the same. You're moving fast in slow motion, basically. And I think that's what I'm most interested in right now is how to design an architecture in slow motion.
Another way to phrase that might be, but this might not be your phrase, that what it means is to fall out of the boat and not get wet.
Now you got to explain that one.
Let me. There's
Is that
another,
like walking on water or something? I can't do that.
That's your problem.
That'll be the title of your next book.
Let me move to another subject, which is I think more directly connected than initially it would appear to be. Some of you recall David Gerber, who's about to get his PhD from Points East and will be coming here in the spring to teach the ubiquitous building information modeling and parametric design and so on. Quite an unusual character, both in an esoteric way and in a more prosaic way. And when he was talking to me about the advantages of building information modeling and the software and the technology, he talked about something that he called the fear factor. The fear factor. And in that context, he was referring to clients looking somewhat askance at certain kinds of buildings and building ideas. And the argument in this context for building information modeling and the parametric interrelationship between pieces in the building was to curtail, to eliminate, to mitigate the so-called fear factor in architecture. And I thought maybe it would be useful to you as a venue to talk about or to define what you might consider to be the fear factor, either inside going out or outside reflecting on or speculating on what you're doing. What would the fear factor be?
In a public forum, huh? I mean, when you're in the midst of it, you don't really, you're not really that scared for some reason. It's afterwards you realize the gun was loaded, and you go, whoa, that's, even whether or not you're talking conceptually or actually when I get a fear factor?
What he was talking about was the apprehension of a client looking at a quasi-illegible series of drawings and models and trying to figure out how to quantify and qualify and ultimately justify building. And what could we do in very practical and pragmatic terms to alleviate that kind of pressure on a client. And there are modeling systems, at least one could argue, that make what is less legible more legible and quantifiable and all of that. But there's another definition potentially that has to do with fear factor, which might relate just to apprehension about certain kinds of building propositions in architecture, which are less than normative in some ways, and how those become plausible in the world. Mm-hmm. If you ask Lebbeus why Lebbeus draws and doesn't build, he can tell you, and in a way he's avoiding the fear factor. He doesn't have to make that equation. So it's a phrase. I mean, it seemed to be useful.
There's. I mean, the fact that we're given we're given a lot of resources, and the older I get, the more I feel the responsibility of being responsible with the resources that I'm given. But I still carry with me what I had from the very early days, is that I always assumed that the client would totally agree with me if they saw the world the way I saw it. You know, if they could understand, if they could see what I see, if they could understand what I understand, they would totally agree. It doesn't in any way remove or eliminate the apprehension that you have, because it's a roll of the dice. The stuff that I do is nowhere near a roll of the dice that what other people are doing these days. So it's, you know, my stuff looks very sane compared to some of the other stuff. So you can say, oh, God, look at so-and-so. Now that's crazy, you know. And they go, oh, yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. But I get, you know, I don't know. It's interesting because this particular project, I was so confident in what I was doing and what we were doing as a team, because the work is, it truly is a result of a team of people, not just the consultants, but in the office. One of the ways that we work in establishing a new practice some years ago was to try to figure out ways that my authority in the office goes horizontal when we're in the midst of the creative part of the project. It's always very hierarchical on payday, but when we're working on the project, it's very horizontal. I mean, the one thing that I know from teaching all of these years and from the people that are in the office, all of whom are younger than me, and every year they get a little bit younger, a lot younger, is that I'm often reminded, hearing them talk, I'm reminded of the ideas or the kinds of thoughts I used to be able to have for a whole host of reasons, mostly hardening of the arteries. It might be that I just don't see things the way they see. The younger you are, the advantage of youth is that you don't have enough experience to know that what you're talking about won't work. And so you go for it. When you get older, you edit out a lot of things before you even test them, which is where the problem lies. So the more expert you become, the fewer chances you take, is the way it tends to be. I think the way we were raised here, and I think still the ethos of this place is that everything, as crazy as things are, things seem normal. Even the people, you walk around this place, and it looks like, you know, people are on parole, you know, and they're students and faculty. And I think that's, they are on parole, yeah. But I get apprehensive quite a bit at various stages in the project, and I know clients get apprehensive. I think what helps them be less apprehensive is the degree of confidence and levity that I usually bring to a project. I was told once by a client, I was really scared. I was going into a big negotiation for a fee. You know, we're used to, you know, somebody shows us dirt and we get started, you know, before we even have a contract, at least in the old days. You were just excited somebody would just give you their backyard, you know, or give you anything, and you just start working. We actually even scared away clients a couple of times, Tom and I, when they called us up and wanted to have a meeting, and by the time they came for the first meeting, we actually had a model. And we had vowed not to show them the model because we thought, you know, because we talked to them, oh yeah, we're listening, we're collaborative, you know. And we pulled out the model and they walked out the door and never came back, you know. I don't know if clients can understand the drawings and the models. They don't see the world that way. The first time I showed an axonometric to a client, and they kept on sort of turning their head like the RCA dog, you know, and I thought they could see it. I said, well, you don't see it? And they said, no, I can't see it. What is it? Is that 3D? And I say, yeah, it's three-dimensional. Can't you see it? And then it dawned on me, if you don't have that image already in the visual cortex, you can't see it. We work in ways that we can see things that don't exist yet. We can see from a plan, we can see the space. From the plan, we see the section. From the section, we see, you know, it's not necessarily the case with clients. Now, you could do renderings of space, and they can tend to see that, I suppose. On this one, we just, I talked a lot and showed them a lot of models. I think what worked on this is that the dean of the school and the president of the university, it wouldn't have mattered what we showed. They wanted us to do a building so badly. And that's the only way you can get a good project up is if you have an advocate, and the advocate has to be the person who's in charge. You cannot get a good building up if you're working with a corporation and your client is middle management. It'll never happen. If it happens, it'll be an aberration of the process, I would say. So you basically have to have somebody who really wants it to be that way for it to happen. And in my experience, there's no exception to that.
Let me jump into another aberration. In the social and political context that we find ourselves in at the moment, particularly in traveling, there seems to be a lot of anger and disappointment with America, what America means, American foreign policy in the world and all of that. Most of my colleagues, the people I know, probably in the end would vote for the Democrats. So this is their way of taking a position on events in the world, which may be substantive in terms of voting, but is not necessarily particularly committal in terms of the content or the obligations of the work. And the question is, to what extent, and of course this is asking for the impossible, to what extent is the practice of architecture in your hands, and particularly in terms of the positions that you've taken in the book and as an advocacy position, to what extent do the kind of social and political issues that are so fundamental to a broader discourse of what's going on in the world have anything specifically to do with the processing of work, project by project?
Doing the work or the experience of it?
Well, the content of the work, does the content of the work carry, comment on, critique, move, adjust? Is it part of that world, or is it separate from it? Or is the job just to go in and vote for Kerry and then go out and do whatever you do?
I think it's part of the work, but the work, the way it's not a critique or a commentary on current situation. I think we can be. I think I can be more effective, not being presumptuous to speak for all of you. I think I can be more effective by working towards a more fundamental relationship we have with each other and the world. And instead of keeping it symbolic like any language, it's trying to truly create community, creating spaces that people want to gather in and spend time together, facing each other and talking about whatever it is they need to talk about. Tough stuff, easy stuff. The one thing, again, back to this place, which is a lens through which I see a lot of things, is that the degree of openness that exists in this place, the physical openness that exists in this place, creates an atmosphere of cooperation, which balances out the competition that normally would occur in places like this. And you tend to feel a little bit more free in looking at what's going on around and taking note. And then perhaps even saying, okay, I'm going to show my friends what he could have done with that idea. So there's, in the case of any of the projects, but in particular this project here, the primary objective for me was to create a culture of cooperation rather than a culture of competition. And the way that translates is that there's no place to hide in the building, no place to hide at all. Even the classrooms, everything is on the main canyon space, totally transparent, acoustic separation, but you could see through the building. So you could stand on any level and see into any of the spaces almost all the way through to the other side. And so you could see.
But I remember going through the Reichstag project fosters glass piece a year or so ago, and being told that transparency physically is a reflection of openness politically. And the question is that so, or is this incredibly naive? Because of course the argument is you go into a space which is wide open, but what you don't see is four guys in the parking lot before the meeting actually deciding what their positions will be. So in the end, the question is whether the language of the architecture in the space can carry a value about openness, or is the openness the space and the operation of the space and the underlying meaning of the politics in Germany and other places actually belongs to a discussion which can't be represented in form and space in architecture, can't be touched or can be touched.
I think architecture is inherently a political act. Whenever you modulate space, and which predetermines how people bump into each other, politics enters. What I'm saying is I don't write it on the walls, what I believe. I'll say it in the classroom. I always have to tell students that this is not a rational thing, but don't tell me who you voted for, because it'll affect your grade, you know. I do. I just cannot imagine anybody.
So you have a candidate.
Anybody under, well, I just can't imagine, I can't imagine young people or minorities voting Republican. It just seems like an anathema to me, you know. It does. You know, I just cannot understand that. Now, I was raised by, my father say, first thing you do is that you look to see if there's any Italian names on the ballot. And then I said, well, what if they're Republican? That don't matter. They're good people, you know. And I said, well, what if there's no Italians? He said, then you vote a Democrat, you know. So that's how I still vote, you know.
Marinetti for president.
I think in I don't know. I think it's a good question you're getting at. I'm just I don't know. As I often think, when we were younger and we had a target on the wall, the caliber of the bullet was more important than the aim. You know, we wanted to sort of blow the whole target off the wall. And the older you get, for a whole lot of reasons, a lot of it is just conservation of energy. The aim is better than the caliber of the bullet, you know. And so the political stuff, it has to always be present. Because I think whoever you are is what you manifest. The saying in either quantum theory or wisdom traditions, who you are and what you observe is one and the same thing. There's no separation between those two things. So who you are and what you manifest are one and the same thing. If you wake up in a bad mood, everything that day is going to be in a bad mood, including your buildings. If you're a schmuck, you do schmuck things.
But let me I'm fishing around for an example of this, and I think there's some important historic examples. If you take a look at the Schindler House, for instance, which is nominally in the idiom that now puts Dwell magazine at the checkout stand in Gelson's and sells something which is supposed to be modern architecture. But at the time Schindler was doing it, the language of the building was less an idiom, a style, a repeat, a motif, a system, any of that. And it also had to do with like it or not, particularly in that house, a sociological idea, how people should live together, how families should live together. So there was a component of that discourse in the architecture and the space that was related to a social advocacy, which I think at that time was considered to be a radical social advocacy, whether it was husband swapping or wife, whatever he was promoting over there. But certainly there was some kind of social idealism or some kind of social concept. So the origin of that discussion of what came to be known 50, 60 years later in the hands of untold numbers of architects was at the point of origin carrying a message which could be sustained beyond the language or the style of the building itself. And there are other examples of that. A lot of the Russian work in the 20s, in the early 30s, the Vesnin brothers and Tatlin and others, making projects for a very different constituency, the argument ran. Meaning it wasn't the 19th century, that nobody was making Versailles, but everybody was making clubs and workers' houses and stadia and all of that. All projects imagined, almost none built. But the drawings have to do with a social advocacy and a social perspective in a very palpable, tangible way. The question is whether that's still part of the discussion, your discussion or anybody's discussion, or the content, the sociological content. I don't mean in a superficial way, and I'm not implying that it would, you could walk into the labyrinth of Minos and tell who to vote for president. I don't mean that, but there is something that conceivably is.
I totally, no, the one area that historically there's been the most experiment, the one typology, it was housing. Housing doesn't exist for the same reasons as it, for architecture, as it did in the early days. The Schindler House, it could be multifamily housing. They were looking at program. They were really starting to explore how people lived. Now, it's plan type A, B, C, or D. And if you have you have another site, the same guys that are doing all of the housing, they basically just sort of trim it and make it fit. It has nothing to do with program. Virtually nothing to do with program. Spaces are taller, they're shorter, they're wider. It's nonsense. It has nothing to do with how people live in this city. If you're really to look at, I'd love to do housing, but I won't. I resist doing housing for people that just want to move units. I'm not interested in moving units, whether it be records or whether it be housing apartments. There is so many interesting types that we could challenge right now in this city with all of the ethnic groups. The different living configurations are much more exciting, much broader than we see types that are being built. If you were just to take on housing for all of the immigrants that are coming here from Central America to work, and instead of having the densest part of Los Angeles being MacArthur Park because 12 guys are in 600 square feet, and their entire social life is deteriorated, creating a lot of social problems, which then gets argued and debated in Washington, D.C., and then they build a stupid fence, or they talk about building a stupid fence. You could attack that problem, architects could attack that problem by just designing the right kind of housing, rooms configured in a way so people begin to develop a sense of community and a sense of being at home, even with strangers. It would have a radical effect on all of the systems that start with that particular layout. What's that thing in the movies? Cell phones off, please. Actually, I had a cell phone go off once when I was giving a lecture. And I said, oh no. So I decided the only way to deal with it is to open it up. And they said, oh, they have a question for me. I don't think program is being challenged these days. I think the old saying that we used to we were sort of half serious about, because I think we had a lot more latitude in the early days of LA practice, was that your conscience goes where the checkbook is. I think anything that you could read about Albert Speer will put it in perspective. That's what's happening today. Not necessarily, I'm not comparing all of us to Speer and Hitler, but you tell me where the program is being challenged. Where the center line should be between form and content. It's not. It's mostly form. It's mostly form. The way it's practiced, not necessarily the way it's practiced here, the way it's practiced out there. I don't think it is. I don't think programs are being challenged. I think you have to work. You have to start with the life you start with your own inner life and figure out how do I make sense of that and try to figure out what meaning it has in the context of the rest of society, or in particular the tribe that you're working with, so you can figure out how an architecture can emerge out of that so it's not so self-centered.
Let me ask you something else, I think, which is related to that. There was, I think, a time in this city when you began to work, and the kind of conceptual effort that appeared was a surprise, aggressive, even astonishing. And I think it didn't seem to fit, was more misfit than fit, didn't really have a home. People looked askance at it. And the question, I think now, this is less an answer than a speculation about whether that quality in work has been, let's say, what was once astonishing, has been transformed to the sense that outside the box sells pharmaceuticals, gasoline, corporations, so that there is, in the end, nothing that astonishes anymore, because the idea of astonishment has been emasculated and transformed and positioned to serve a very different end. And what always has interested me is how quickly this culture adapts and takes what's outside of it, what contests it, and brings it inside. It takes it off the edge and moves it into the middle, or it takes it off the perimeter and moves it into the center. So it absorbs, and as it absorbs, it controls, and as it controls, it emasculates, and as it emasculates, it takes the fear factor out of what was once frightening and unrecognizable. So I don't know whether there's a particular response to that, but I guess the question would be, is there anything we can produce architecturally now that would surprise anyone, that would astonish anyone? Is that capacity anymore, for the moment, part of the discourse of architecture?
I would say that if we're trying to outrage, no. I mean, no. I think what would surprise people is silence. I think people have a hard time with silence. I think some people have an impossible time with silence. I think people have an impossible time with stillness. I mean, how many times have we heard, boy, this is going to be nice when it's finished? And you say, well, it is.
But this is the noisiest culture, I think, not the most profound, but certainly the noisiest. This film, this disc, this video, this iPod, nowhere you can go that belongs only to you and your own internal discourse. Hard to find that.
Oh, it is.
And invention, I mean, technical invention, which
I don't think there's invention these days. I think it's innovation. There's innovation. The example that we had from the 20s all the way through up until recent years, probably, let's say within the last 10 years, was Bell Laboratories. Bell Laboratories had a whole area of research that was considered pure research. There was no end game. They didn't have to take it to market. They were just doing pure research. And virtually everything that we have on our desk right now came from that place. The vacuum tube, the transistor, the diodes, all of that stuff started with pure research, then it was handed over. And then somebody figured out, what do you make with this? There was a time when we didn't have any work, and it's still the case, I think, among architects, young architects, that when you don't have any work, you stay busy by doing a whole host of things, inventing projects, doing competitions, whatever. But I think there's innovation because there's such a pressure to get it to market in whatever form that takes as quickly as possible. It might be because you need credit before somebody else, or you want to be known that you're the inventor of that. It might be that you're trying to sell something. There's a kind of gold rush mentality these days. Not everybody, but there tends to be sort of embedded in the ethos of America, day trading mentality. I mean, if you just look in real estate used to have just investment cycles. A fast investment cycle 15 years ago used to be 7 years. And then it became 4 years, then it became 2 years. Now it's like tomorrow. It's like you buy today, sell it tomorrow. I mean, you buy it today, sell it today, and literally. And so there's like this day trading, and what happens is that all of us, including myself, you can feel yourself as you move through the city, through the world. It's like a bad fluorescent light bulb. Everybody's kind of vibrating.
Let me try to put it a slightly different way. I mean, if you look at some of the imagery and the language of the building, and hopefully we'll get to that, the technology question and the image of technology and technical advocacy as part of the accepted language in architecture, the expression of architecture, make it look like an oil rig in the North Sea, whether it's Lloyd's or a kind of rougher version of that. And it seems to me that at the advent of that discussion, Lodz, Prouvé, the sense that a technical world, whether this was accurate or not, but technical progress actually moved the world in an inventive way. So the higher the building, the longer the bridge, the further the airplane flies and all of that. And it seems to me, although the advocacy is still around and the image of technique is still around, that the role of technology in the world is actually much more a kind of pacification program, at least in terms of flat screens and iPods. Nothing particularly for or against those, but it's the most powerful manifestation of technique handed out in the world, I think, to make everybody, if not giggly, at least comfortable and friendly. And these are the manifestations of technology that are aspired to. So technology is radical, or technology that would overturn what we already have, is not anymore the meaning of that imagery. And I think I mentioned a few minutes ago the sort of modernist, qua-modernist, when modernism is dead, which becomes a popular magazine, the Dwell magazine. And if you look at the language of this, of some of it, and you can see that, I mean, you can see that as it is a kind of expressionism about that. And if somebody were to cruise through here 50 years ago or 50 years from now, and the selection of that, pipes, tubes, channels, all of those things, and what they're saying now, and this is, I think this is a little bit related to the kind of very abstract philosophical discourse of Paul de Man and Derrida and what is come to be understood as deconstruction. And then you saw in that little essay we wrote about the Biennale, and then all of a sudden the World Trade Center got hit. And in a very literal sense, the intellectual advocacy of Derrida and meanings are private, and there's no Moby Dick, there are only Moby Dicks, and so on. That there's no consistent perspective, but that there are only multiple perspective. Everything is in pieces, everything comes apart. And this is with respect to everything which hadn't come apart. And then you walk around that site and you see everything in pieces, and you wonder now, what is the meaning of continuing to build in a language which has been described as deconstruction after what happened at the World Trade Center. So both in this sense, in terms of what could be read as an advocacy of technique, and in terms of a kind of deconstructed, meaning a private demolition and reconstitution of a building, What does that mean now as a consequence of where technology is manifest in the world, or what happened downtown in Manhattan? In other words, where do you go with this stuff as a language? And maybe...
Aren't you glad you're not the one who has to answer that question?
Yeah, but everybody knows...
I mean, I would say simply yes.
Yeah. But everybody, to be honest, everybody has to answer it in one way or another.
I know. I'm playing with you. On Friday, it was fun to actually see the student work, the gallery work of Daly Genick, or Chris and Kevin, and then this, and it was definitely products of generations. You know, it starts with no straight lines to sort of straight lines to straight lines. You know, with pretense of some things that curve. I see moving parts. You know, I have to see moving parts. I mean, I used to get killed when my son first started getting video games. He'd go off screen and then zap me from someplace, you know, and I'd say, "How did you do that?" And he said, "How did you know where I was?" You know, because I go off screen too. He goes, "I just knew where you were." You know, sort of like reading cards in Las Vegas or something, you know. There's a practical side to making buildings like this, which is, you know, when you're given a fixed amount of money, and over the years you figure out how to build things in a way that there's the fewest number of moves. If you could name that tune in one note, you'll get it built. Absolutely certain you're going to get it built, because the equation is time and material. The more material you have, the more time it takes, the more it costs. It's simple. That's basically what it is. So you basically try to eliminate as much body fat as possible in a building. In the case of this building, part of it had to do with our own predilection to make buildings this way, but part of it had to do with from every Sciarc that we've been in, the first one and this one in particular, you could actually walk around and there were textbook examples of how to make a building, especially the first one. The first one, there was, I don't know, it was like the outsider, it was like outsider architecture, like outsider art, the first building. It was like going to an alto building, which is insider architecture, where structural systems change. Whatever it was, whatever material was available, whatever the forces were that were acting on the building, whoever was there making it at that particular time, and whatever mood they were in, the building had that body language. And this entire project is to some degree machine made, but essentially handmade. The excitement with using brick is that there aren't too many materials left where the building only goes up as fast as your hand moves. You pick something up and you put it down. Terrazzo and brick moves at the speed that terrazzo and brick moves, not the speed at which money moves. Money moves faster than the speed of thought, and we've seen in recent years it definitely moves faster than conscience. I think it's important that we figure out how to slow it down. And when you slow it down, people start to see things they didn't see when they were moving so fast. And I think at Prairie View, the building moved at whatever, it moved quite fast for a building of this scale. But it was just a wonderful experience to see this thing built. Now it's built as an additive system. All the systems are added one to the other. In the early days, we did tuck and roll. You know, in the shop, you'd say mortise and tenon. Tuck and roll is when one material folds into another, or, you know, it's labor intensive. And one person has to stop their work and step back so another person can step forward and do their work. Now that kind of sequencing makes it problematic in terms of stretching the dollars. On a building like this, literally one system is added on top of another system. Now what that also does is it allows the students and the faculty to walk through the school and to point to things. So they don't only have to be bored in the classroom. The classes that really historically put everybody to sleep, not at Sciarc though, mechanical systems, electrical systems, There's good teachers here. You could walk through the school and point to things and learn from it. In this case, it was done in a very systematic way. Years ago, we were working on an Indian reservation, and the first time it really hit me in the forehead like a dart, because it seemed so obvious, was when we were taught that the teepee was an instrument of teaching. An architecture was truly an instrument of teaching, not figuratively. The grandparent would sit with the grandchild in the teepee and talk about how it's made, but they'd also talk about what it meant. So you'd go basically from earth to sky by sitting in that building. And the entire, and the thing was it basically, the entire cosmology of the tribe was embedded in that building, embodied in the building. Now that, it doesn't happen to that extent in any things that we do, because we don't have any kind of universal cosmology. Even in the same family, we don't. But the building is intended to be an instrument of teaching to some degree. And so the systems are expressed as that, in that way. But that also folds into just a delight of making things in this way. I don't think it's deconstruction in the definition of deconstruction as it was originally defined in architecture, but definitely all systems are evident here.
But it's not an advocacy building. It's an options building.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning that there are a number of venues delivered in a number of languages, as opposed to, let's say, when we were talking about technique, let's say an example of that could be Lloyd's, which seems to be, if not simple-minded, but certainly single-minded. This seems to be much more the fox than the hedgehog. So if you're teaching a number of possibilities. You're not saying it should be this way and not that way, or this is permitted and that's not allowed. It doesn't say that.
No. Another thing I learned here in a whole variety of ways was when you want to keep people's imaginations moving, especially if you're in a position of authority, you come to the table and tell them what you're thinking about as opposed to how to think. And I think there's a way of practicing architecture where you try to do that as well. And I mean, in the practical side is, just to make a building that is in part all concrete. There's a whole concrete frame that runs through this thing. It's a joy to figure out how do you do that. How do you do that? The canyon space had to do with how do you, one of the exciting places to be able to stand, and there's not too many places here where you can do that, when things are really active in the hallway, is up above, so you can look down. So this thing here is a combination of Sciarc and the Van Nel factory, which has, all of the ramps and stuff. It's like all the Ford factories, it's all of those ramps and conveyors that are flying through the space, This, if there is no program in the building, one of the things that we've been interested in, I think throughout, through both of my, careers or venues, is what I refer to as pure program. Pure program for me is regardless of whether or not you're hungry, you got to go to the bathroom, you're going to have a conversation with somebody. Pure program is the body's experience moving through space. And moving through space, the ground, up and on top, and moving horizontally, moving vertically, moving diagonally, and diagonal means across as well.
Well, what this seems to be about, and what you're calling the canyon, is again multiple vantage points. I mean, it's not Versailles. and it's not the Champs-Élysées.
There's vantage points, but there's
different ways to see and different ways to understand, and what you see up above is different than what you see down below, and what you see, as opposed to, for instance, this is the way to see, and this is the path to take, and this is the way to understand, which hypothetically would be a way to do it.
Yeah, but it's not only just seeing optically, and not only actually with the third eye. It's like Thoreau said when he is one evening at Walden's Pond, everything was lined up for the guy. Right temperature, right mood, right time of day. My body is one sense tonight. And he describes it in a way where your entire body gets that hit, that chill, where you know exactly what he's talking about. There is a very subtle but profound transaction between the body and the environment that it's moving through, all of the time. We bring in an immense amount of information autonomically that the body processes in ways that we're not conscious of. I think it's possible to actually modulate that information coming into the body by the way you move through the space.
One of the useful things, this is much more about a completed project. Original conceptual idea. I mean, look at the models. The model's not so different from what actually is delivered. And the question is, and it may be, and there are certainly contexts in which this is so, that what you start out with is very much what you finish with. And that has a lot to do, and I think this is a particular interest to me, with how clearly you understand at the beginning what you might wind up with at the end. And it might be useful anyway to talk for 10 seconds about how it got to be what it was, or not only what we see on the wall, but what we don't see.
Most of the, we had a very short window in order to do the building for a number of reasons, well, actually one in particular. Prairie View, which is one of the historically black universities and colleges, as it's called, which is actually one of the premier universities in that respect. Because it was part of the Texas A&M system, every dollar that most of the campuses were given, Prairie View was given a quarter. A lot of smart people came out of Prairie View. I don't know the whole history of the lawsuit. There was a federal suit that was filed. The federal government, the Civil Rights Commission, said that the state legislature of Texas had to give Prairie View approximately $190 million to make up for those inequities. The president of the university decided he's going to take at least half of that money and build new facilities. And he, our good fortune, believed that architecture was the premier program in any university. And so he said he was going to put a lot of money into the School of Architecture, as well as a cultural center. And the cultural center is the seed for archives of African American history in this part of Texas. Because they had been fighting for the state legislature and the Texas A&M system had been fighting for so long, the end date that was legislated or was mandated by the courts didn't go out, but the date was moving towards that. So we had 13 months from the signing of the contract. We had to deliver the working drawings on this building. 108,000 square feet. 108,000 square feet. I said, impossible, can't do that. Nope, I'm not going to do it. And then they said, okay, next architect. I can do it. I can do it. So we immediately, all of the variations and all the possibilities, both in terms of sites on the campus, diagrams of the building on the site, as well as the possible configurations of the interior and the exterior, were all done in drawing. And then we moved into modeling as quickly as possible once we all decided that this was the direction that we were going in. And then one of the things that you often talk about with students, stick with your scheme. It's not dead just because you think it's dead. It's like 2 weeks before the end of the semester, you throw it out and start over. Sometimes it's the night before, and it drives me nuts. You understand why, I actually wanted to burn my project. I almost did. My last project here, 3 o'clock in the morning, what comes to mind is that I'm the dumbest human being on the face of the earth. I shouldn't have, that I'm completely irresponsible thinking that I could practice architecture. I mean, all that stuff goes through your, and I almost set my drawings on fire, Now, I didn't, and, all's well that ends well. This project, we basically just drilled a hole right through it. We took all of the variations of color, pulled them together so that we were trying to make white light and burn a hole right through. Once we figured on the configuration and the organization of the building, it was then just a matter of how do we build this thing. So we basically were, at the completion of schematics, we were starting construction documents pretty much. But we were still doing schematics all the way through to the end. It was a fast track. But the project had to be bid. It had to be competitively bid, so we couldn't be designing the building beyond the date that it went out to bid. So the models are, they're pretty much where we started is where we ended up. Well, it isn't where we ended up. The difference is from one moment to the next was more subtle. It was more subtle. It was like the angle of the brick. It was basically doing calligraphy on the building. It was trying to figure out how do you get just the right line on that. What is the right height to raise a 60-foot brick wall that's 60 feet wide? What's the right height so it feels like it's levitating? So it's not doing radical moves on the form. It's a more subtle move. How do you make, in the inside is like, how do you, the staircase is, it's the Spanish Steps. It's the Laurentian Library. It's all of those stairs that you know about. It's where people hang out. Where do you meet in Rome when you don't know anything about Rome? The Spanish Steps. What stairway do you go see in Florence? The Laurentian Library.
Actually, it would be useful to see some of those images. I think every year, every academic year, I give a little talk to the students that are just coming in. And this year, I showed a tower that we're working on, and then I showed Joseph Albers in Maxville, Lucan Tower, Tatleen, a series of towers. And really the discussion led to a question of originality and what it means, which is a subject you take on in the book. But it also is not necessarily mitigated or compromised by associations with pieces that are part of the history of architecture, which I think is what you're saying.
Yeah. No, I think, we were all told growing up in a whole variety of ways. Some of it came through the airwaves, some of it was in the oxygen we breathe, is that you had to change dates and pretend like you didn't see anything at all, because you had to be the original one. You had to basically say, yeah, no, I never, like somebody would say, where did that come from? Well, I don't know, I don't read, have you seen such and such? No, I've been blind since birth, so this is like pure, I mean, it's just all nonsense. It's all nonsense. Starting at the cellular level, if you're not part of a network, if you're not in context, you die. Creativity occurs in context. Everything that exists at this moment in time, even if it hasn't been discovered, has existed for all time based on the scale of our existence. So it's a total conceit. It's a total and utter conceit to think that anybody's original. It's variations. It's variation. Not only do we not talk about the derivation of the work that we do, we don't even talk about the people we work with. That's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. That's what we have to be fighting against. We have to eliminate that. That's why we're in Iraq. That would sound like reefer madness. You go from that to Iraq. In any case, you have to know history. Your work in history can't just go back to 1972.
Well, let me give you an example. Okay. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna. I wanted to say one thing before I forgot. I was looking at that squiggly diagram right there. Just to give you an example of not concerning ourselves with being original. I was giving an exercise to the students at Prairie View, and I wanted to give them an exercise that helped them reach a higher state of concentration. And one of the difficult things, as you know, when you're reading, just think about when you're reading any essay or a book that you have for a class, your mind is wandering. You got to come back and refocus. It happens a lot. Your mind is always wandering. One of the great practices is how do you keep your mind focused? How do you reach higher and higher states of concentration? And you do that by making your mind quiet and making your body still. Well, in this case, if you drink wine, if you drink good wine, if you drink cheap wine, it doesn't matter. If you drink good wine, you drink it slowly because the wine unfolds. If you're eating if you're a foodie and you're eating really, really good food, if you're not paying attention, the flavors unfold, but you're not aware of it. Good fortune favors a prepared mind. A prepared mind means somebody is paying attention. Now, the exercise that I did with the students, part of it was for my own education. I wanted them to listen to a piece of music, and then I wanted them to do a drawing that was the length of their body, that drew the melodic line and the beat, as I say, or the rhythmic increment. And the other part of the exercise was to get a piece of food from the grandmother, and then they had to describe, without bringing the food in, they had to describe to the rest of the class everything from the texture of biting into the food to the emulsifying of the food and the flavors unfolding. If the students couldn't guess what the food was, then you didn't pass, right? So the students had to pay attention when they were eating. Well, what surprised me with the music, I thought they were going to all bring in hip-hop, because they had to play the music really low, and they had to describe the drawing, and then they had to dance. I thought that'd be cool. I was afraid they were going to ask me to do that.
Let me before we get to McDonald's, let me try to.
Fast food was not allowed.
I know, it's like music, elevator music. But I want to go back to the originality discussion just for a moment, and I think I wouldn't argue the world gets better, but I think I could probably argue that the world gets different. And the question is how that happens. And I was trying to think of an example. This is probably not the best example, but if you looked at the Boston Public Library, which is McKim, Mead, and White, 1900, and some of you know that building and have grown up with the building, and then you look at Braque, Gris, and Picasso in 1903 or something, whether you could differentiate those three artists, different question. But clearly the advent of something which I think we could argue is contentious, adversarial, and pretty clearly turned its back. And I'm juxtaposing art and a way of making art. Before it got to be a school and a system and a theory and something taught and learned and so on, which was very, very different fundamentally as manifest in the Boston Public Library, which belongs to a history of painting and building, and a very different, all of a sudden, very different, small group of people, contentious, adversarial, turned the whole discussion somewhere else. So I think the question, anyway, I don't know how often that happens. It may have happened in LA at a certain point in time. It may happen again. But it's a fascinating moment, actually, and I think in retrospect, to try to understand it, so it's not just everything is additive. There's something else that happens, which is a kind of conceptual, whether it's defiance in an extroverted sense, or turning one's back on what is extrovert, but if something happens.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying that everything is just additive. I'm just concerned that we're in a perpetual state of adolescence, which is when you're always concerned about people recognizing you. You know, that you have to continually make sure that people know.
This is a completely different problem. I think you're talking about the difference between public relations and content. I would say
I'm talking about the predisposition to always be concerned about whether or not you're original in everything you do. I'm not talking about difference. Difference is essential to the growth.
But I'm saying there is something called originality, and it doesn't exist because somebody decided to be original. I mean, I give you another example, which I think is an interesting example. If you write a sentence and it has a capital letter and a noun and a verb and a period, and you write that way for centuries, let's say, and then somebody comes along and says, look, original, unoriginal, doesn't matter. What I want to write and what I want to describe and the way I want to say it can't be said with a capital letter and a noun and a verb and a period. It could be E.E. Cummings, it could be James Joyce. Whatever their motivation or whatever their interest and attention, in a way, is completely irrelevant. It really doesn't matter what their motive is. It only matters, in my view, whether there's substance to the case that they're making, which changes the definition of literature, painting, architecture, science, or whatever it is. I mean, you can like or
I know. See, I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't continue to argue if things were moving at the pace they were when the people that you're talking about were doing their work. Right now, the pace at which we move doesn't allow any time to reflect, and so there is. I think it has to do with degrees of order. I think when you zoom out, you look back down, all you see is patterns. It's not about this is like turn this way a little bit more, or turn that way a little bit more, or it's a little bit more this or a little bit less that. I think perhaps at the scale of our existence, originality you can notice it. I'm concerned that the focus is on that these days, as it was to some extent
that may be the reaction.
And I'm saying there has to be time spent in reflection. And when you go into reflection, there's a much bigger context that you exist in.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I think you're dealing with the reaction to what's done, as opposed to the substance, what is intrinsic to what's done. And because there's a lot of interest in the promotional aspects of lots and lots of things, that wouldn't necessarily mean that the content isn't there.
No, I don't think it's just promotion. That's an aspect of it, I suppose. But I think if you define yourself by always comparing yourself to others, that's a problem. That's a problem.
Right. Let me ask you something else, and just have one or two more things. One is that either by intention or by accident, I think you've developed a reputation, and I think you would acknowledge it, and I think it's important to you and important to the way people understand your work, which has something to do with, the words are not so easy, but spiritual side, religious side. There's some comments in there about, Siddhartha Gautama with his hand on the ground, Buddhism, those kinds of things. And so there is a kind of sensibility that I think comes out of you, your advocacy, and the discussion of the work that has to do with that as a sensibility or as a persona for a particular architect in a particular place at a particular time. Is that accurate? What does it mean? Where does it come from? How is it constructive? Or maybe it's not so. Maybe you don't like it.
No, I think, over the last 15 years, but in particular, starting 17 years ago, when I fell in love again, deeply in love again, I realized that what was important is to strike a balance between matters of the mind and matters of the heart. And I think architecture, what I was embedded in and where I was heading was primarily a practice that had to do with matters of the mind, and matters of the heart were left behind. And it can be called a lot of things. I think of spiritual as being the still point in between those two. And I think what is most attractive, I don't see myself as, I don't practice any particular religion. My practices are without beliefs. At least I try to stay there. I was raised Roman Catholic, so I still periodically, say mea culpa, but it's, I think it's just a love of people, as simple as that. I think it's just an extraordinary gift for all of us that are able to practice architecture. And I think the responsibility that we have, because we see the world in a peculiar way and with a certain kind of intensity, our responsibility is to create a world where others can experience that. And in recent years, the Still Points piece that we did downstairs a few years ago, it was done with the Lone Ranger in mind. The reason being, I came to a point where I realized that a real aspiration is not an achievement, but a real aspiration would be to come into town, do your thing, the town is better, you leave town, doesn't matter if people know who you are. Doesn't matter if people know who you are. People are asking, who was that masked man? You ride off into the sunset with a big smile on your face. Not easy to do.
But they all know who the Lone Ranger is, actually. Well, maybe they don't, actually.
I don't know.
With that statement, the advocacy, that the job of the architect is to make available to others, to make accessible to others what the architect knows or has come to know. So I think this is quite a remarkable statement. I think at that point, very touching, very beautiful, very moving, and maybe we can't beat that one, to put it in intellectual terms.
Thank you.
So maybe that's enough for the afternoon, unless somebody wants to add.
Well, before any y'all leave, what I'd like to say is that first, the people in my office, could you stand up, please? Everybody in the office. I just want to see who's not here. No, just kidding. Hey, just kidding. Just kidding. So these are the Rotoids. Actually, I'm the Rotoid. They're the. So this. Thank you all. Great crew of people. And then one more thing. These images here are the photography and the quality of the prints, which some of them actually look like renderings, is Farshid Asasi, who has been a collaborator in this regard. Asasi, are you here? Where are you? Stand up for a second. Extraordinary photographer and fine artist right there. And then chief collaborator always, April Greiman. So, but I thank you all for coming, and I thank all of the faculty that are here. The one thing that I'll say finally in closing is what Eric and Chris and Ming and the others have done. And I can speak with authority, and it's unarguable medical fact, because I know this place very, very well. As they've brought the school not only back to full strength, but beyond. And I think the school is in the best shape it's ever been in, notwithstanding anything. Actually, I see the complaints as meaning, as a sign that things are in really good shape. But in any case, the faculty, the young faculty that's here, the younger faculty that's here, I think is the next generation of practitioners that are going to be making, I don't know. There's a great group of faculty. The students that are still coming here, I think, are the exceptional students in the country. And so I'd just like to also thank Eric for just the exceptional care that he's taken in bringing this place back to full strength. So thank you.